The movie opens with an elderly man, Paul Edgecombe, waking suddenly from a dream, his face filled with unease. A chilling whisper lingers in his mind. You love your sister? You make any noise, you know what happens. Shaken but composed, Paul gets out of bed, washes his face, and starts his day. The setting is a quiet nursing home in Louisiana. Paul, despite the strict rules, has a habit of taking long walks every day, something that isn't exactly allowed. He doesn't seem to care. With a piece of leftover, cold bread in hand, he strolls towards an old cottage near the home. There's something about that place, something important, but the movie doesn't reveal what just yet. One evening, Paul and his friends gather in the common room, watching television. They flip through the channels, looking for something interesting, when they land on the classic film Top Hat. The moment Paul sees it, his expression changes. His eyes welled up with tears, and before anyone could react, he got up and left the room, stepping outside into the cool night air. Concerned, his friend Elaine follows him. She gently asks if the movie is what upset him. Paul hesitates for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to speak. Then, with a deep breath, he finally begins to tell his story. The movie shifts as Paul Edgecombe begins to recount his past, taking us back to 1935, during the Great Depression. At that time, Paul was a prison guard at Cold Mountain Penitentiary, overseeing death row, where prisoners awaited execution. Most prisons called it the Last Mile, but Cold Mountain had a different name for it, the Green Mile, named after the faded lime-colored floor that stretched through the block. The executions were carried out using an electric chair, known to the guards as Old Sparky. Paul wasn't alone in his duties. He worked alongside Brutus Brutal Howell, Harry Terwilliger, Bill Dodge, and Dean Stanton, all professional and fair men. But there was also Percy Wetmore, a sadistic, power-hungry guard with a fierce temper. Nobody liked him, but because of his family connections to the governor, they had no choice but to tolerate him. At the time, Paul was dealing with a painful urinary infection, the worst he had ever experienced. Every trip to the restroom felt like passing razor blades, making his days on the mile even more unbearable. That was also the year that John Coffey arrived at Cold Mountain. Coffey was a massive, towering man, convicted of the rape and murder of 2 young white girls. His size alone made him intimidating, but the moment he spoke, it was clear he was different. He was shy, soft-spoken, and emotional, nothing like the violent criminals Paul had seen before. As he was placed in his cell, Coffey muttered something strange. I couldn't help it, boss. I tried to take it back, but it was too late. Paul didn't understand what he meant, but something about those words lingered in his mind. Later, as Paul read through Coffey's conviction sheet, he learned about the crime in detail. 2 little girls had gone missing from their home in Louisiana, and their father, Klaus, along with the neighbors, launched a frantic search. Eventually, they found John deep in the woods, sitting in the dirt, clutching the bloodied bodies of the girls. He was weeping, stroking their hair, and howling in anguish. Everyone assumed the worst. John had kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered them. The case seemed open and shut. But as Paul read through the files, something about it didn't sit right. One day, Paul was approached by his superior, Hal Morse, who had 2 important updates. First, Percy Wetmore was considering leaving to take an administration job at Briar Ridge Mental Hospital. But he refused to leave. Paul speculates that Percy will leave not until he gets to personally witness an execution up close. Second, Hal had a more personal concern. His wife, Melinda, was gravely ill. He will be taking her to Vicksburg in the next day or so, for some tests. That night, Paul shared the news with his wife, Jan, telling her about Melinda's condition and about the new inmate, John Coffey, who, despite his conviction, seemed simple-minded and childlike. Meanwhile, life in the prison carried on. One evening, Brutus and Dean discovered a small mouse in the cell block, hiding in the storage room. The little creature became a source of joy for the inmates and even the guards. But when Percy saw it, he immediately decided to kill it, simply because it made people happy. He searched for it, but the mouse was too clever, always disappearing before he could catch it. Around the same time, the guards began preparing for an execution. Arlen Bitterbuck, a Native American prisoner sentenced to death. Percy was trained in proper execution procedures, particularly why a wet sponge must be placed on the condemned's head, to ensure the electricity flows through the brain quickly, delivering a swift, painless death. When Arlen's execution took place, it was carried out smoothly, just as practiced. Afterward, Percy approached Paul with a deal. He wanted to take Brutal's place during the next execution, just once, in exchange for finally leaving the prison for good. Paul didn't trust him, but it seemed like the only way to get rid of Percy for good. Days later, one of the inmates, Edouard Delacroix, did something unexpected. He tamed a little mouse and named it Mr. Jingles. The two had developed an incredible bond, and Delacroix even taught the mouse tricks, amazing the other prisoners and guards alike. But before Paul had time to dwell on it, he was summoned by Hal Morse once again. There was a new inmate arriving at Cold Mountain, one unlike any they had seen before. His name was William Wild Bill Wharton. Wild Bill was a vicious, unhinged criminal, sentenced to death for murdering 3 people during a hold-up. As Hal spoke, Paul noticed something was wrong. His voice cracked, and his eyes welled with tears. Paul asked him what was going on, and Hal finally admitted it. Melinda had a brain tumor the size of a lemon, buried so deep that doctors couldn't operate. He knew there was nothing the doctors could do. Hal was devastated, and he had no idea how to tell his wife she was dying. Paul could see it in Hal's face. He was a broken man, clinging to the last bit of hope he had left. And at that moment, Paul felt just as helpless. Paul Edgecombe's urinary tract infection worsened, waking him in the middle of the night with unbearable pain. The next morning, he told his wife he was going to visit the doctor, but instead, he went straight to work. His presence was needed for the arrival of a new prisoner, William Wild Bill Wharton. Wharton wasn't just a killer, he was completely unpredictable, a man who thrived on chaos. As soon as he arrived, he proved to be trouble, resisting the guards with violent outbursts. After a struggle, Paul and his team managed to restrain him and place him in his cell. Paul, still in pain, tried to carry on, but John Coffey noticed his suffering. Insisting Paul come closer, John reached out, grabbing Paul by the bladder, and in an instant, a miracle occurred. Paul felt an incredible sensation as Coffey took his illness from him. Moments later, Coffey exhaled a swarm of black insects from his mouth, expelling the sickness he had taken. Stunned and amazed, Paul tested his newfound relief, finding that the pain was completely gone. That night, he returned home to his wife, who was equally astonished and grateful. In gratitude, she baked cornbread for Coffey, which he later shared with fellow inmate Edward Delacroix and Mr. Jingles, Delacroix's beloved mouse. Still grappling with the reality of what had happened, Paul visited Bert Hammersmith, John Coffey's defense attorney. He wanted to know what Hammersmith truly thought of Coffey. Was he capable of such a crime? Hammersmith, adhering to the legal principle that everyone is entitled to a defense, had represented Coffey in his trial. However, he remained skeptical of Coffey's innocence. He explained to Paul that some criminals could appear simple or gentle but still commit horrific acts. He compared Coffey to his own family dog, which had once seemed harmless, until it suddenly attacked his child. To him, John Coffey was no different. Paul, however, was starting to believe otherwise. One day, Edward and Mr. Jingles were invited by politicians to perform tricks. While they were away, the prison guards rehearsed the upcoming execution of Delacroix, with Percy Wetmore set to oversee it. After the rehearsal, Percy mocked Edward, causing him to stumble. As Percy smugly returned to his desk, Wharton seized the opportunity, grabbing Percy and threatening to kill him. Terrified, Percy wet himself, much to the amusement of Edward, who laughed uncontrollably. Humiliated, Percy swore revenge on Edward and stormed out. Paul assured Edward that he would take care of Mr. Jingles when Edward was gone. But tragedy struck when Edward, playing fetch with Mr. Jingles, accidentally tossed the wooden spool outside his cell. Percy, seeing an opportunity for cruelty, stomped on Mr. Jingles, killing it. Devastated, Edward was inconsolable. But Coffey intervened once again. He asked Paul to hand him the tiny, lifeless mouse. In front of the guards and Edward, John Coffey performed yet another miracle, bringing Mr. Jingles back to life. The mouse scurried back to Edward, unharmed. Paul turned to Percy and gave him a warning that after Edward's execution, Percy would be leaving the mile for good. Percy, though still fuming, agreed. When Edward's time came, he handed Mr. Jingles to Paul, but Paul admitted he couldn't care for him during the execution. Coffee volunteered to take care of the mouse, at least for now. As Edward was led to the electric chair, Percy, still harboring resentment, purposely failed to wet the sponge that was meant to conduct electricity properly. The result was horrific. Edward burned alive in the chair, suffering in unimaginable agony before finally succumbing. Mr. Jingles felt the pain through John, who had passed part of his gift to the mouse. Paul was horrified. The brutal execution shook him deeply, but it also reminded him of someone else who needed help, Melinda Morse, the terminally ill wife of Warden Hal Morse. Paul and his fellow guards devised a plan. They would sneak John Coffey out of the prison and bring him to Hal's house. Percy was bound, gagged, and locked away, while Wharton was drugged into a deep sleep. As the guards escorted Coffey down the corridor, Wharton suddenly woke up and grabbed John's arm. John flinched. He had sensed something. Looking into Wharton's heart, John saw the truth. As Wharton drifted back to sleep, John simply muttered, "He is a bad man." At Hal's house, Coffey miraculously healed Melinda. Her sickness vanished, and for the first time in years, she was full of life. When asked how he did it, Coffey simply replied, "I took it back." But this time, the insects didn't leave him. Paul and Brutus knew John had swallowed Melinda's sickness for a reason. Back at the mile, Percy was released from his restraints and John immediately grabbed Percy as soon as he got the chance. He forcefully transferred the sickness into him, and Percy, now under John's control, staggered toward Wharton's cell. He drew his gun and shot Wharton dead. Moments later, the insects burst from Percy's mouth, leaving him in a catatonic state. Percy was later admitted to Briar Ridge Mental Hospital, not as a staff member, but as a patient. Paul finally saw the truth. John Coffey was innocent. The real murderer of the two girls had been Wharton all along. Through his supernatural gift, Coffey had shown Paul the crime as it happened. The realization crushed Paul. An innocent man was about to die. Desperate, Paul considered helping Coffey escape. But John refused. When Paul confessed his fear of standing before God, explaining that he didn't want to answer for executing one of his true miracles, Coffey reassured him. He told Paul to say that it was a kindness, that he was tired of being lonely, tired of witnessing the cruelty of the world, tired of feeling the suffering of others. Paul understood. But before Coffey's execution, they asked him what he wanted. John had never seen a flicker show before. So together, the guards and Coffey watched Top Hat. The day of John's execution arrived. As he entered the chamber, the families of the murdered girls sat in front of the electric chair, full of hatred. But Brutal told him to ignore them and feel what the guards felt for him instead, love. As John sat in the chair, tears streamed down Paul's face. John whispered the words from the movie, I'm in heaven," and then, he was gone. Years later, an elderly Paul sat with Elaine, recounting his story. He led her to a small cottage, where Mr. Jingles still lived. Decades had passed, yet the little mouse was still alive, a living testament to Coffey's gift. Paul had outlived everyone he loved, his friends, his wife, even Elaine. And he believed it was his punishment, his atonement for letting John ride the lightning. Paul knew that immortality was never his to claim, nor did he desire it. Yet, as the years stretched on, he found himself wishing for death long before it would finally come. Night after night, he lay in bed, staring into the darkness, waiting, thinking. He thought about the people he had loved, now long gone. He thought about the Green Mile, the final path each person must walk, knowing that every one of them had their time. And yet, one thought haunted him most of all, keeping him awake as the hours dragged on. If he could make a mouse live so long, how much longer do I have? Paul understood the truth. Every soul owed a death, there were no exceptions. But as he waited, burdened by memories that refused to fade, he couldn't help but feel it in his bones. Oh God, sometimes, the Green Mile seems so long.